This is Patrice Bergeron, and he's about to score the most memorable hockey goal of all time. But how did we get here? In a Game 7 series with the Toronto Maple Leafs, the Boston Bruins find themselves in overtime after climbing out of a 4-1 hole in the third period. Shot for shot, this was anyone's game. Toronto was trying to close the game out after choking their lead away, while Boston needed to complete the comeback to stay alive in the playoffs. With 6:05 on the clock, Patrice Bergeron would do something the hockey world would never forget. April 2013, and the NHL playoffs are about to begin. Now, this was back in a time where the NHL had 6 divisions that teams could play under. The Toronto Maple Leafs finished 3rd in the Northeast Division and had earned themselves the 5th seed in a shortened lockout season. The Leafs were set to be a part of the playoffs for the first time since 2004, and after a long playoff drought of 9 years, there seemed to be a change in the atmosphere of Toronto. Fans had heightened their anticipation for the series, and the pressure for Toronto to perform was at an all-time high. At this time, Toronto's roster was not the flashiest, headlined by Phil Kessel, James Van Riemsdyk, Nazem Kadri, and Dion Phaneuf. Toronto's greatest strength was in their top line and goaltending. Phil Kessel and Nazem Kadri were both averaging a point per game, while James Reimer carried a .926 save percentage and a .246 goals against average with him into the playoffs. Meanwhile, the Boston Bruins had just finished their season as the 2nd seed in the Northeast Division with a record of 28-14-6, earning themselves the 3rd seed in the playoffs. Now, I'm not sure if you were watching Boston hockey back in 2013, but this team was absolutely loaded with talent, headlined by Patrice Bergeron, Brad Marchand, Tyler Seguin, Jaromir Jagr, Zdeno Chara, Dougie Hamilton, and of course Tuukka Rask. The Big Bad Bruins were in full effect at this time, and they were considered the most physical team in all of hockey, using guys like Sean Thornton, Adam McQuaid, and Milan Lucic to instill fear in their opponents' eyes. Boston had just won a cup 2 years prior to this season, and they were looking to bring the cup back to Boston with a star-studded roster. There was no clear favorite heading into the series. While Boston did have the better roster on paper, many still believed that Toronto would have enough to knock out the league's deadliest team. With the matchup set, fans would witness the start to one of the NHL's newest rivalries that would live on for the next decade. May 1st, 2013, location TD Garden, Boston, Massachusetts. The heavily anticipated matchup begins, and Toronto starts the scoring off early with a power play goal from Van Riemsdyk. Toronto leads the game 1-0, but this wouldn't hold for long. In the final 5 minutes of the first block, both Redden and Horton would pot goals and end the period 2-1 in favor of Boston. Period 2 was all Boston as well, with a no-goal call from Tyler Seguin and 2 goals from David Krejci and Johnny Boychuk. Period 3 and both teams were unable to get on the score sheet, but clearly this was Boston's game as they took a 1-0 series lead. Game 2 in TD Garden, Boston, and both teams come out strong and physical in the first period, but really this was just a battle between Rask and Reimer as both teams head to the locker room scoreless after 1. The Bruins come out with the same energy as Game 1 in Period 2 though, and get the first goal of the game from Nathan Horton, but Toronto was not going to let this shake their confidence. Joffrey Lupul would score 2 goals for Toronto and end the second period 2-1 in favor of the Leafs. Period 3 starts and Phil Kessel would extend the lead for Toronto to make the game 3-1. Johnny Boychuk would then score the next goal for the Bruins, but Boston couldn't pull off the comeback in this game. Final score 4-2 and the series is now tied 1-1. May 6, 2013, Toronto, Ontario, Air Canada Centre. The series shifts home for Toronto as they look to take a lead in this competitive series. Period 1 and Adam McQuaid rips one past Reimer to give Boston the early lead. Minimal scoring in the first block, but Period 2 is where both teams came alive. Boston gets the next goal of the game from Rich Peverley, but Toronto would answer back fast with a Jake Gardiner goal. The remainder of the period was all Boston as they get 2 more goals from Paia and Horton to end that period. Period 3, both teams would exchange goals, but this whole game was dominated by the Bruins. Boston takes Game 3 5-2 and leads the series 2-1. After a tough loss in their first home game, Game 4 and Toronto looks to bounce back for the next game of the series. Period 1 and Toronto controlled everything, scoring 2 goals and possessing the puck for most of the period. Period 2 and Boston would come clawing back with a goal from Bergeron and 2 from Krejci. However, Toronto would grab one of their own, tying the game 3-3 at the end of the second block. Period 3 and it was anyone's game. The two teams would remain scoreless throughout the remainder of regulation, and with that, we have our first overtime game of the series. Overtime period and the two teams traded shot for shot, but it was David Krejci who would get the final goal, earning himself a playoff hat trick and a massive win on the road for Boston. Final 4-3, Bruins lead the series 3-1. Game 5. Both teams head back to Boston, and the Bruins look to close out the series early on. Now, this was more about defense and goaltending than it was goals like the rest of the series. Rask and Reimer played phenomenally in period 1, but period 2, Toronto opened the scoring with a goal from Tyler Bozak. Period 3, and the two teams would exchange goals, giving Toronto the edge and a final score of 2-1. Series 3-2 still in favor of Boston. Game 6, and the boys are headed back to Toronto. Boston looks for another chance to close the series out, but similarly to the previous game, they just struggled to get anything by Reimer. Toronto also couldn't figure out Rask for the first 2 periods of the game, but in period 3 they managed to get 2 by him and give them a lead and eventually the game 6 win at home. Toronto takes game 6 2-1, tying the series 3 apiece. The best 2 words in sports. Game 7. May 13th, 2013. Location TD Garden, Boston, Massachusetts. The Bruins, unable to close the series in Game 5 and 6, look to change their fate in a Game 7 matchup at home. Toronto, having all the confidence in the world, looks to continue their comeback and move into round 2. Period 1 opens up and the two teams exchange goals, one from Matt Barkowski of the Bruins and another from Cody Franzen of the Leafs. Period 2 was more defensive, but Toronto received another goal from Franzen to take the lead ahead of period 3. 2-1, Leafs head into the locker room with the lead. Period 3 and the first 10 minutes were all Toronto. Phil Kessel would open the period with a goal, which was followed by another from Nazem Kadri with 14:21 left in the game to give Toronto the 4-1 lead. TD Garden was quiet, and the Bruins looked crushed. But what happened next will blow your mind. At 9:18, Nathan Horton would get a goal for Boston, making the score 4-2 in favor of Toronto. Time ticked down towards what appeared to be the end of Boston's season. But then, with 1:22 remaining on the clock, Milan Lucic would get the puck past the goal line to make the game 4-3, and things would just get interesting. Boston has the puck in Toronto's end. They push out the Bergeron line for the final minute of the period. Empty net, and the Bruins begin to apply pressure. With 50.2 seconds remaining on the clock, Patrice Bergeron would rip one past James Reimer to tie the game 4-4. TD Garden came alive, and the Bruins had just got themselves back into a thrilling Game 7. Neither team scored for the remainder of the period, and the game would be decided in overtime. Overtime starts and the two teams look desperate, exchanging possessions that seemed like they held the weight of the world on each stride. Bergeron, the third period hero, hit the ice and helped the Bruins maintain a strong possession in Toronto's end. A shot that fired off the net with a rebound squeaks out to Bergeron, where he would bury the final goal in the series, winning the first round for the Bruins, solidifying one of the most iconic and memorable comebacks in NHL history.
To Bergeron, the drive, save, rebound is loose, saving kicks and loose.
As a Bruins fan, this was an all-time moment, but I'm curious to hear what other NHL fans think about this. Is this the greatest comeback in NHL history for a single Game 7? Make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel for more content if you haven't already, and comment your reactions to this all-time NHL moment. I'll see you guys in the next one.